Steel screamed before anyone could react. Not a warning shot. Not a test. A wound. A battleship built to terrify oceans suddenly convulsed, struck by something it was never meant to respect. This was floating dominance, armored confidence, a weapon designed to end arguments before they began. And yet, in one violent moment, belief collapsed faster than steel. The sea did not care about size, reputation, or doctrine. Men stood frozen, not from fear of death, but from the shock of betrayal, because everything they trusted had just lied to them. Orders echoed through corridors that suddenly felt fragile. The ship lived, but its invincibility died screaming. Deep inside, systems failed that were promised to never fail. And far away, beyond the smoke and confusion, there had already been doubts. Quiet ones, ignored ones. No alarms. No confessions. Just a dangerous decision to sail forward. Anyway, so when power is warned, stays silent, and chooses confidence over caution, who is responsible when the ocean collects its debt? The night had settled into that dangerous calm that tricks men into believing nothing is hunting them. A smooth black surface broken only by the low rhythm of engines and the soft slap of water against steel, while somewhere ahead a small Corvette cut through the dark with intent sharp enough to taste, its crew silent, eyes fixed forward, knowing they were already inside a moment that would not forgive hesitation. On the battleship, confidence moved like oxygen through the decks. Routine watches, casual footsteps, conversations carried without urgency. Because nothing this large was supposed to feel threatened by something this small. Not out here, not like this, not tonight. The sea smelled the same as it always did, oil and salt and damp steel. But beneath that familiarity was a tension no one aboard the battleship recognized until it was too late. The Corvette adjusted its course by degrees. So slight they felt harmless, slipping into position with the patience of something that understood exactly where the blind spots lived. Somewhere on the battleship, a lookout scanned the darkness and saw nothing worth reporting. Because expectation filters vision as much as fog ever could. Distance collapsed quietly. The sound of the smaller ship's engines blended into the background noise of the ocean, unnoticed, unchallenged, unfeared. Then came the launch, not loud, not dramatic, just a subtle mechanical motion followed by a brief disturbance in the water that vanished almost as soon as it appeared. The torpedo running low and fast, invisible beneath the surface, carrying a future no one aboard the battleship had prepared themselves to imagine. Seconds stretched. The battleship continued forward, massive and assured, its crew unaware that the sea beneath them was no longer empty. When the impact came, it did not announce itself with a warning. It arrived as a violent interruption, a concussive force that tore through the hull with a sound like the ship itself screaming in pain, throwing men off their feet, snapping lights into darkness, and turning confidence into instant confusion. The deck lurched. Bulkheads shuddered. Somewhere deep inside, metal folded where it was never supposed to bend, and water began to rush in with the urgency of something that knew it had been invited. Shouts replaced routine. Orders collided with questions. Men scrambled through smoke and darkness, hands reaching for ladders, valves each other, while the ship tried desperately to understand what had just happened to it. Alarms finally screamed, but they felt late, embarrassed, like apologies that arrived after the damage was done. The Corvette did not linger to admire its work. It slipped back into the night, mission completed, leaving behind a giant struggling to stay upright. Inside the battleship, damage control teams fought a battle they had never rehearsed like this, sealing compartments, dragging hoses, working in ankle-deep water that kept rising anyway. The ship slowed, not by command, but by injury, its momentum bleeding away as systems failed in sequence, one assumption after another collapsing under pressure. Men listened to the groan of stressed steel and wondered, for the first time, if the ocean might actually take them. Communication faltered. Power flickered. The smell of burned wiring mixed with seawater and fear. No one needed an explanation to know something fundamental had gone wrong. The evidence was flooding in around their boots. The battleship did not sink that night, but survival felt less like victory and more like survival on borrowed time, as if the sea had made a point and chosen not to finish the sentence. As the crew stabilized the damage and the ship limped onward, a new understanding settled over them, heavy and unspoken. This was not an unlucky hit, not a freak moment of chance, but the precise instant when certainty failed, when a smaller ship rewrote the rules with a single strike. And everyone aboard could feel it in their bones. Whatever had just happened was going to follow them far beyond this night. Asterisk before the strike. The story was simple, clean, and repeated so often it felt unbreakable. This ship was dominance made. Physical, a moving wall of certainty that smaller threats were never meant to challenge directly. A presence so overwhelming that danger was supposed to hesitate before even trying. Confidence was not just emotional, it was institutional, baked into training, posture, and planning, reinforced every time steel displaced water without consequence. The battleship did not merely sail, it asserted. Crews were taught to trust its mass, to believe that thickness equaled safety and power equaled immunity, that the ocean respected size the same way men did. Smaller ships were spoken of as irritations, fast and annoying perhaps, but ultimately incapable of delivering real harm to something built like this. Not in one decisive moment, not without overwhelming force behind them. The official promise was never framed as arrogance, but as logic. More steel, more strength, more survival. That belief shaped behavior in subtle ways, in relaxed watches, in assumptions about distance, in the quiet confidence that nothing close to insignificant could ever be catastrophic. The torpedo in this narrative was a problem meant for other ships, lesser ships, vessels without the luxury of layered protection and sheer physical dominance. It was supposed to be a threat that bounced, failed, or at worst inconvenienced, not something that could alter the course of the night. Doctrine whispered reassurance long before any officer spoke it aloud. This was how naval power was supposed to look, feel, and function, and then reality arrived without permission. The contrast was not gradual. It was violent and immediate. The same steel that symbolized security became a conduit for shock. The same mass that promised safety amplified the damage when momentum met vulnerability. What was meant to intimidate suddenly struggled, not against an armada, but against the consequences of believing too deeply in its own narrative. The torpedo did not just tear metal. It tore through expectation, exposing a gap between what was promised and what actually existed beneath the surface. The battleship had not failed to perform some complex maneuver. It had failed at the most basic assumption of all that: it could not be hurt like this. The official story said this scenario should not have been possible, that this class of ship was designed precisely to avoid being humbled by a single unseen strike. Yet the water pouring through ruptured compartments told a different story, one that did not care about charts or confidence. Crews trained to manage fires and surface damage suddenly found themselves fighting an enemy that came from below, silent and relentless, turning familiar spaces into hazards. The promise had been protection through superiority, but superiority became a liability when it bred certainty instead of caution. The contrast sharpened further in the aftermath, as the ship remained afloat but undeniably altered, its survival framed as proof that the system worked, even as everyone aboard knew how close they had come to something far worse. Official confidence tried to reassert itself, clinging to the idea that endurance equaled success, that not sinking meant not failing. But endurance is not invincibility, and survival does not erase exposure. The reality was that something small had reached something massive, something dismissed had proven decisive, and the gap between expectation and experience could no longer be ignored by those who felt it in their bones. The institution had promised predictability, A clean hierarchy of threats where power flowed in one direction, and the ocean had quietly reversed the equation. What made the contrast feel like betrayal rather than surprise was how natural the confidence had felt before it broke, how reasonable the assumptions seemed until the moment they collapsed. This was not blind faith. It was engineered belief, reinforced by repetition, and rewarded by years without consequence. That made its failure heavier, more unsettling, because it suggested that the problem was not a single bad night, but the story itself. The battleship had done exactly what it was expected to do: sail forward, unafraid, assured of its place at the top of the food chain. The Corvette had done what it was never expected to do: matter. Between those two realities lay the uncomfortable truth that doctrine had not prepared the Navy for what actually happened, only for what it believed should happen. The promise was dominance without vulnerability. The reality was power exposed by its own certainty. And once that contrast was seen, it could not be unseen, because if this ship could be hurt like this, then the question was no longer whether the expectation was flawed, but how many other assumptions were waiting to break. The same way. At first, it was easier to treat what happened as an exception, a strange collision of circumstance and chance that could be filed away and mentally contained. But the ocean has a cruel way of repeating itself when lessons are ignored. Somewhere else, on another stretch of dark water, another crew trusted the same promises and moved with the same confidence, believing that what happened before was rare enough to never touch them. Then it happened again. Not identically, not theatrically, but familiarly. A small attacker slipped through expectation. A single strike landed where confidence said it shouldn't. And once more steel learned that belief does not stop water. Different men felt the same lurch beneath their feet, heard the same tortured groan of a ship realizing it had been wounded, smelled the same mixture of seawater and panic-filling spaces that were never meant to flood. The details changed, the sea changed, the faces changed, but the feeling was unmistakable, surprise curdling into dread as the impossible repeated itself. Reports accumulated quietly, each one describing a moment when assurance failed faster. Then reaction time, when dominance proved slower than something smaller, quieter, and more patient. Each incident carried the same emotional residue, crews asking the same unspoken questions, officers offering the same reassurances that sounded thinner every time they were repeated. The pattern did not announce itself loudly. It crept in through similarity, the same kind of approach, the same shock of impact, the same scramble to contain damage that doctrine said should have been manageable, even as it clearly was not. These were not wildly different failures requiring new excuses. They were echoes close enough to make coincidence feel dishonest. With every repetition, the weight of inevitability grew heavier, as if the sea was demonstrating a lesson slowly, deliberately, waiting to see how many times it would need to strike before it was acknowledged. Confidence adjusted at the edges but never at the core, treating each incident as a lesson already learned rather than a warning still being ignored. Sailors compared stories in low voices, realizing how familiar each other's fear sounded. How identical the moments of disbelief felt when protection turned porous. The horror was not just that it kept happening, but that it happened in ways that felt predictable once you had lived through it, like watching the same mistake play out with new names attached. Each new incident eroded the comfort of denial, replacing it with a quiet understanding that this was not bad luck chasing good ships, but a vulnerability traveling with them wherever they sailed. The pattern did not require technical explanation to be felt. It announced itself through repetition, through the uncomfortable realization that survival depended more on chance than design. What should have been an anomaly began to look like a warning ignored in stereo, then in chorus. The ocean was not experimenting, it was confirming. And with each confirmation, the idea that this problem would simply fade away became harder to defend. The dread no longer came from the initial shock of being hit, but from the growing sense that this was how it would continue. Small threats, underestimated, slipping past confidence and rewriting outcomes one torpedo at a time. By the time the pattern was impossible to dismiss, it had already claimed its place in routine, normalized enough to be discussed without urgency, dangerous enough to never truly feel safe again. This was no longer a single failure with unfortunate timing. It was a system revealing itself through repetition, a flaw that did not scream for attention but whispered again and again, until listening became unavoidable. Some accident to guilt did not arrive with an explosion, but with paperwork, quiet conversations, and uneasy pauses where decisive action should have been. Long before steel was torn open at sea, there had been moments when concern surfaced in controlled settings, when outcomes felt wrong, when results failed to match the confidence wrapped around them. Reports existed that did not read like triumphs. Tests produced behaviors that raised eyebrows instead of cheers. Observations were made by people who understood the implications well enough to feel uncomfortable, even if they could not yet prove disaster. These warnings did not shout. They murmured, cautious and technical, easy to minimize in rooms far removed from spray and darkness. Concerns traveled upward slowly, softened by language, diluted by reassurance, framed as issues for later review, rather than immediate threat. Each step up the chain added distance from consequence, until urgency dissolved into abstraction. Decisions followed a familiar path: postpone deeper scrutiny, adjust the wording, emphasize what worked instead of what didn't. Silence became a tool, not a coincidence. No single order condemned sailors to risk, but a pattern of inaction did. The same job more quietly. The most unsettling part was not that warnings were missed, but that they were seen and treated as inconveniences rather than alarms. Doubt was managed, not confronted. Uncomfortable results were contextualized until they no longer demanded change. In official spaces, confidence remained the dominant tone. Because admitting vulnerability threatened more than safety, it threatened identity. Acknowledging the problem meant questioning doctrine, reputation, and long-held beliefs about power and control. So hesitation won. The ocean, meanwhile, waited. When the failures at sea began to mirror the earlier concerns, the connection should have been impossible to ignore, yet recognition lagged behind reality. Each incident was absorbed into the existing narrative rather than allowed to challenge. It framed as unfortunate, but contained, serious but not fundamental. This delay carried weight. Every ignored warning quietly compounded risk, turning what could have been caution into consequence. By the time the pattern could no longer be dismissed, damage had already become the proof that concern had been justified all along. What transformed ignorance into guilt was not the existence of uncertainty, but the choice to live with it, to sail forward knowing questions remained unanswered. The sea did not expose secrets that no one possessed. It punished the decision to keep them unresolved. And once that line was crossed, once knowledge and action separated, responsibility stopped being abstract. It settled heavily on the realization that lives had been placed in danger not because no one knew better, but because knowing better was inconvenient. The failure was no longer just mechanical or tactical, it was ethical. Silence, delay, and confidence had collaborated, and the cost of that collaboration was about to be paid by people who never saw the reports, never attended the meetings, and never had the chance to say no. When the focus finally shifts away from steel and doctrine, what remains are faces, voices, and moments that never made it into official summaries. Men who went to sea carrying ordinary lives behind them and returned carrying memories that never loosened their grip. There were sailors barely old enough to have learned the weight of routine, standing watch with hands that still shook long after the ship was stabilized, replaying the sound of impact in their heads because it arrived without warning and refused to leave. In flooded compartments, fear was not dramatic or heroic. It was quiet and animal, measured in breaths taken too fast. in boots slipping on wet metal, in the panic of not knowing whether the next bulkhead would hold or give way. Some men worked in darkness so complete they could not see their own hands, relying on shouted directions and instinct as water crept higher, wondering if the ship that was supposed to protect them had already decided otherwise. Others were trapped by injury, pinned by debris, listening to the fight around them and unsure if rescue would arrive before the sea did. Names that meant everything to families back home became lines in logs and casualty lists, their absence felt most sharply in letters that stopped arriving and beds that stayed empty. For those who survived, the cost did not end with the voyage. It followed them ashore in fragments of sound and motion, in the way sudden vibrations made hearts race. In the knowledge that trust had been misplaced, officers carried the weight differently, replaying decisions and assumptions, aware that confidence had been inherited along with command, and that doubt had been taught as weakness. Families were given careful explanations that avoided uncomfortable truths, reassured that loss was part of service, even as questions lingered about why danger had been underestimated in the first place. The human cost was not just death or injury, but erosion of faith in leadership, of certainty in promises, of the idea that sacrifice was always necessary rather than sometimes avoidable. Each sailor had stepped aboard believing the system around them had been honest about risk, that protection meant more than words spoken at briefings. When that belief cracked, it left behind a quiet bitterness that no metal could fully address. The ocean had taken its share, but it was the realization of preventability that cut deepest, the sense that survival and loss had been decided long before the torpedo ever ran its course. These were not anonymous figures moved by history. They were sons, brothers, fathers, friends, carrying the cost of decisions made far above the waterline. And in their stories, repeated in different accents and memories, the same truth surfaced again and again. The greatest damage was not inflicted by the enemy alone, but by the gap between what they were told would keep them safe and what actually stood between them and the sea. The battleship sailed on, scarred but afloat, its presence still imposing enough to reassure those who needed reassurance, even as the silence around what had happened grew heavier with every mile. Official language softened the incident, reshaping it into a lesson learned rather than a warning ignored, allowing confidence to return without fully confronting what had been exposed. Adjustments were made quietly, just enough to suggest progress, never enough to demand accountability. What lingered was not outrage, but absence, the absence of honest reckoning, the absence of questions asked loudly enough to demand uncomfortable answers. The ocean kept its own record, indifferent to narrative, holding the truth in pressure and darkness where reports could not reach. Sailors carried their memories forward, aware that survival had been granted, not guaranteed, and that the difference mattered more than anyone was willing to admit. Somewhere between acknowledgement and denial, the institution chose to move on, trusting time to dull the edges of doubt. But time does not erase patterns. It only buries them deeper, waiting for the next moment when belief outruns caution again. The most unsettling realization was not that this vulnerability existed, but that it could exist quietly, managed rather than resolved, protected by silence instead of corrected by urgency. If this could happen once and be absorbed without full confession, then it could happen again under a different name, in a different sea, to another crew equally certain of their safety. The unanswered question was not whether the Navy adapted, but whether it truly listened, or simply adjusted enough to keep sailing without looking too closely at the cost. In the end, what haunts the wake of this story is not the torpedo that struck, but the knowledge that warning signs had already surfaced and were allowed to fade into background noise. Steel can be repaired, ships can be refitted, and doctrine can be rewritten, but silence has a longer memory. And if the ocean taught anything that night, it was this: when power chooses comfort over truth, how many more secrets does it expect the sea to keep?